minutes have not been circulated, have they?
Yes, they were.
They were circulated.
Yes, they were.
Can we, on the same basis as before, have a proposal that the minutes be accepted? I think we had we did last, we confirmed the ones before. You have 8th, 15th, and 22nd.
She was saying that those were circulated, but they were never confirmed by the committee.
Yeah, I mean, the minutes are very dense, and I know that members may not have had time to read all of them in detail. But as a practical matter, we need to have them confirmed for the committee meetings to come to an end. The key thing is going to be the report, and you have my undertaking. We won't rely on the minutes to force something on the report. Right. So just for good order and procedure, can we just have a confirmation of the minutes that were circulated for May 8th, 15th, and 22nd? Thank you. All in favor? Aye. Okay. Now, I believe we had reached, we were to start at clause 23 on page 28. Yeah. And this first is on enforcement. General Counsel, are you taking this on? Okay.
Thank you, Minister. So, clause 23 of the bill.
Before we start, I thought you'd formally, for the record, Chairman, make the announcement that you made earlier. So at least since last time we met, you said that maybe the work we're doing here may impact whoever comes. And I'm hearing that there's an announcement made today.
Yes,
maybe
well,
for the record, it would be useful.
It will impact in the sense that this, if as long as this becomes law, whoever is governor is going to have to abide by these provisions. I was hoping that we could have the law in place before but we started on the process searching for a new governor in January. I appointed a search committee headed by David Marston, and they conducted an extensive search in an open and transparent way, with advertisements placed in local and international newspapers, and it was accompanied by headhunting as well. And I was pleased earlier today to announce that Mr. Richard Biles will be succeeding Governor Winter as Governor of the Bank of Jamaica on the 19th of August. And I have every confidence that he will discharge his functions, the incoming governor, with the same degree of professionalism that has characterized his career to date.
Chairman, I just want to join you in expressing my personal appreciation of the new appointment. I think Mr. Biles has excelled and distinguished himself in a long career in the private sector, in the banking and corporate Jamaica. He, as co-chair of EPOC, I think raised his national profile, and there was a general appreciation of the dispassionate and balanced way in which he approached that. Obviously, his significant corporate experience will be of great use in running a complex organization like BOJ, which is going to be even more complex when we pass this legislation. But it is good that a son of Jamaica of that quality has been willing to serve and to succeed the governor who we have, who I want to take this opportunity to express my appreciation for the excellent job he has done over the years. Have worked closely with him when he was the head of the FSC, less closely with him as an industry participant when he was the head of the BOJ, but as in the cabinet and so on for 4 years, benefited from his sage advice and the transformation of the Jamaican economy to the sustainable trajectory that we're now on occurred at a time when one of the constant presences in the system was Governor Winter. So I think Jamaica owes him a debt of gratitude for his stellar service in that area as well.
Absolutely. I don't want to add to that, lest Governor Winter, I mean, he's governor still, and he's governor for, and, you know, certainly until a new governor takes over. And we will have ample opportunity to celebrate his tenure and the achievements that came with it. So, General Counsel, over to you.
Yes, thank you. So, we are now at page 28, clause 23 of the bill, and this clause introduces a new section 50A, which includes what is described as enforcement provisions. The section speaks to penalties being applied for the contravention of the provisions of the Act or regulations. The intent, however, was for the provision to only apply to the proposed governance regulations, which, as has been explained, will include several provisions of the PBMA appropriately amended. This was one of the provisions that was imported, if I could use that word, from the PBMA. We observe that section 25(1) of the PBMA, which is the equivalent provision, applies to specified sections of the PBMA only. And to go down through these provisions, this includes section 3.3, submission of annual report and audited financial statements, section 4, to do with acquisition of shares and payment of dividends, which section, as you would know, would not apply to BOJ since there are different provisions relating to the BOJ. Sections 5(1) and 2 regarding the exercise of borrowing powers, section 6 on corporate governance, section 7 corporate plans, and section 7A, power of the FS to request information, and so on. So these are provisions of the PBMA which apply to the enforcement provision, which, as I indicated, is now referenced at section 50A. And the point I'm making is that the section as worded, which speaks to Act and regulations, is a little wider than, or is wider than we had intended. We would recommend that, as with section 25(1) of the PBMA, the provisions of the regulations or schedule, whichever way it goes, that this section is intended to apply to be included here. These should mirror the provisions that are referred to in the PBMA that will continue to apply to BOJ. And therefore, Chair and members, what we are proposing is, subject to the draftsman, that section 50A1 should state, if the court is satisfied on an application by the Attorney General that any person has contravened any of the following provisions of the Act or regulations or schedule, then one would list all of those provisions which would have been equivalent to those mentioned in the PBMA. The court may exercise any of the powers referred to in subsection 2. And so the recommendation we have would be that the section be adjusted accordingly. We would note that Member Golding, for completeness in his comments, had suggested that the $1 million cap on the pecuniary penalty in section 50A may be wholly inadequate if the person's contravention has involved the misappropriation of money or other assets or a loss being sustained exceeding that amount. In such cases of misappropriation or loss, the cap on the pecuniary penalty should be equal to the amount of the value misappropriated. As indicated, the intent of the provision is to capture the penalties for the specific breaches that were mentioned and which were being imported. And so the penalties that are to be stated here, we would suggest be in line with those. If there should be a misappropriation of money or other assets, that would result in a separate criminal proceeding with related penalties, including restitution, and would not therefore be limited, we are suggesting, by the provisions of 50A.
Chair, just to make for a couple of points, but just to understand what you've said, Councillor, are you saying that 50A1 is, rather than being a general provision applying to any of the provisions of this Act or regulations, that it would be instead limited to a specific listing of sections that are taken out of the PBMA?
Yes, that was the intent, member. And indeed, throughout the Act, as you will know, there are several provisions related to penalty already for different breaches throughout. So the real intent had been to, as I think one was trying to make sure that the PBMA was properly captured in all its respects that would be applicable. This had been, as I said, for you want of a better word, imported.
So you're saying that the application of this would be to the same subset of provisions that are in the PBMA that will be in the regulations that are to be appended to this bill?
Yes, yes. And I was going down them for you, but it's at section 25(1).
Of the PBMA?
Of the PBMA.
And that's what this provision applies to in the PBMA?
Yes, yes, the exact provision.
Yeah, in its totality, it doesn't apply to anything else, just to that.
Yes, right. And they actually list the sections and put in brackets this summary of what they cover.
Yeah. On the second point, Chair, I just want to make clear that restitution is not a remedy available in criminal proceedings. So neither is compensation. So if there is if you're talking about accountability, and the concept of accountability comes from having to account for what you're doing, you know, capping a pecuniary penalty doesn't achieve that really, you know. And it is true that in most instances, if the bank has suffered a loss, it could, through civil proceedings, try and recover that loss, relying on the law of restitution and so on. But the absence, having a clear black line cause of action created by the statute would be, I would think, a preferable method of succeeding than having to rely on case law around the somewhat, new and evolving topic or subject of the law of restitution. So, it's not in the PBMA, and I think they're just trying to copy what was there. But I'm just making the point, and it's a general point, that it isn't really an adequate approach to take to achieve accountability.
You would suggest not limiting it? Is that what the suggestion would be?
Well, it talks about pecuniary penalty, and essentially that's like a fine, as I understand it. And I'm not suggesting as a fine that it's the wrong level, but I'm saying a restitutionary remedy in the section would be useful. And we've done it, for example, in human trafficking, where if you're convicted of the offense of human trafficking, the court is mandated, I think. I'm not sure if the Crown is just empowered to seek an order, if the court is obliged to do it. But there's a mechanism by which the victim has to be compensated and made whole. And it's not just in human trafficking; it is also in some other more recent things that we have done. I can't remember them offhand, but so I'm just saying this. I just raised it because to me it's a deficiency in how we approach these things, that we don't go for the real gungo, so to speak.
Okay.
So what's the downside of including?
Just if I could, Chair. So the points are taken, Member Golding. To note, first of all, is that if you look at the listing of provisions, that also guides, and you're talking about breaches of power to request the FS to request information, audit committee, corporate governance, fiduciary duties, etc. So the concern you have may not fall squarely, and I'm not thinking that any other remedies that you have in terms of misappropriation would be, you would not be able to take them. Also, we want to be mindful of keeping pace and in keeping step with the PBMA in relation to these offenses, or these breaches, I should say.
I mean, the comment I'd made was when the provision was in its current form,
Yes, which was wide.
which was governed all statutory breaches under the Act or regulations.
That's understood.
Yeah, and whereas now what is being proposed is that it only applies to a narrower list, and I'm not even familiar with that list, but I just thought it was worth raising the point because, I mean, you talked about breaches of fiduciary duty, counsel. I mean, misappropriation of funds by a fiduciary is a breach of fiduciary duty. So that is one area, for example, if somebody has managed to somehow, hack the accounting system of the central bank and it ends up, taking away funds, or other assets, this would be a source, this could be a source of, at least, not only by the way of suing, but also tracing those assets and recovering them, because you have a cause of action against the individual who's committed the breach. So it's useful not only from the point of view of that person's accountability, but also from the point of view of having an effective remedy to recover those stolen assets. Yeah.
Yeah, just Chairman, if we can move away from that, if you're finished, right? Clause 23, 50A1 brings in the Attorney General. I'd love to understand the policy thing, because we know clear that this is criminal activity that is going to be dealt with. Why not the Director of Public Prosecution? Why is the Attorney General being brought into this? And does that extend the independence or compromise the independence, since the Attorney General is invariably a political appointee?
My understanding, and that's a good observation, I think, and my understanding is that this, in fact, suggests that these are civil proceedings, which is another aspect of what we're talking about.
I would have thought so, but as Member Golden pointed out, we're talking about criminal sanctions here. So it's for that reason.
Well, you see, for example, the remedies that are being available under two. One is an injunction, which is a civil remedy, and then this pecuniary penalty is like a civil fine, in effect, yeah? So I think this is coming again out of is it the PBMA? Yeah, so where this provision exists there, I think, and it's the Attorney General is given so I think they've just kind of cut and paste that into this,
But we need to be clear, is it going to be, we're deeming this to be civil and not criminal? Because I think that needs to be made clear. Because
well, I think it depends on the provisions that this will apply to, and since it's applying to the PBMA provisions, presumably it's a list that has already been considered to be an appropriate list for this type of treatment.
Also, in a civil action, it is the parties against the parties. Here, the Crown takes the penalty, so it's a fine that goes to the Crown. So that doesn't really sit with a civil action. And so that's a distinction. So again, we need to be clear. Fish or fowl, civil or criminal, because I don't think it can be a mix of both.
I would think that the Crown does become involved in civil matters as well.
Yeah, I mean, the Crown Proceedings Act is all about how the Crown proceeds. I mean, the Crown Attorney General is a legal officer of the Crown that receives a pecuniary penalty. So, in that sense, yes.
Okay. I'm going to move to 24.
I step in here, Chair.
Well, they use the word the Crown, pay to the Crown. Our recent legislation seems to have this obsession
with the Crown.
So clause 24 of the bill.
I just want for the record, you're saying 23 deals with a civil action and is not intended in any way to be seen or read as a criminal action.
Nor I would say to preclude criminal proceedings to apply in respect of any place where that would be appropriate, maybe including the points that you are making, Member Golding. I don't think this provision precludes such actions that may arise relating to that would warrant a criminal action.
I mean, if an offense has been committed, the person can be prosecuted for the commission of that offense. That same act could theoretically also involve a breach of honor or those provisions and enabling the Attorney General to seek the remedies here, one of which is kind of quasi-civil, quasi-criminal, A, and the other is clearly civil, which is B, the injunction. What there isn't is a right to compensation, which is, I think, a deficiency in the PBMA structure, which we're bringing forward to this. Yeah, I think that there ought to be, if losses are sustained. Now, you have said that, the list doesn't look like a list that involves the making of losses, and that may or may not be so, but...
Should we then consider the draftsman putting a term for the abundance, out of abundance of caution, this may apply to criminal as well, criminal sanctions as well?
Chairman, could I maybe suggest, though, to the member's point, that on this sort of provision, it's important that we think that it moves in step with the PBMA. So the very issues we're discussing would apply equally to the PBMA, which is the whole public sector. So it's not that we can't vary, right? That's the point of having a separate provision for the BOJ, but those variations, you want them to be justified because it's the central bank and for some specific purpose. So this is not a comment against the point being made. It's just to sort of urge that we take those points that should apply more broadly. And I'm not sure what the method is, Chair, that the government would want to use or the Parliament to use to make sure if you change it here, you're going to change it there, so that we don't have a separate regime where the difference is not justified, on the basis that this is the central bank.
One of my concern is bright lawyers do exist, and they look for loopholes in the legislations. So if we can put something there that check that and make sure we get the guilty or the offenders, if it's a civil thing, protected. So it's a question raised out of an abundance of caution that we make sure that this applies to not just civil, but criminal as well.
I think that this is really creating an additional potential sanction for a wrongdoer who has breached certain identified provisions. I don't think it in any way compromises the criminal law, if the criminal law applies. I don't think. But, I mean, maybe the AG's chambers can consider that, in light of the concern raised by Member Brown.
Thank you, Chair. So, clause 24 covers the tenure of board members and the staggering of appointments. It proposes an amendment to the schedule, paragraph 1 of the schedule, by providing for a 10-year term of office for appointed directors instead of the current provision for terms not exceeding 3 years.
Member Robinson, sorry, if I could just if I make one point on the section, Minister. In the course of the PAC, it has become apparent that the surcharge provisions that exist in relation to central government malfeasance doesn't exist amongst public bodies. And I think this provision is probably the public body's equivalent to that. But the lack of an obligation to make restitution for misappropriated assets or funds is, I think, a deficiency.
So how would you propose including it?
I would say, the point has been made by the governor that it's a broader problem than just dealing with it here. So I think it's something which ought to be looked at in the context of greater accountability generally. But if the decision is taken at some point in the future to address that, one has to remember that it needs to be addressed here as well, because we've excluded the application of the PBMA, so it doesn't automatically ratchet together. Yeah.
Point taken.
It's okay, thank you. It's okay. So this clause deals with providing for a 10-year term of office for appointed directors instead of the current provision for a term not exceeding 3 years. It also provides for a staggering of appointments for appointments to be made for 10, 8, 6, 4, and 2 years at the time of first appointment, so that this continuity for which this clause aims is achieved. It also provides that where a vacancy arises prior to the expiry of the full term of appointment, directors shall be appointed for the unexpired term, thereby maintaining the staggered appointments. And it also provides that where a director who serves a full 10-year term is not eligible for re-election, except for the sole director who is appointed for the 10-year period among those first appointed after the amended law would have come into effect. So this is aimed at achieving continuity across political cycles and for the retention of experience and institutional knowledge across cycles. There was a suggestion, a written comment, that it may be preferable for these appointments to be for 10 years and staggered accordingly, 7, 6, 5, 4, and 3 years, in order to aim at achieving the same result. We've looked at that, and the configurations that have been proposed would not achieve that result of continuity across political cycles, as it would be possible for virtually the entire board to be replaced within one political term. So we have a number of permutations, but from all that we have looked at, the 10-year term of appointment and the 2-year stagger achieves what the bill set out to achieve.
Yeah. So, if I may just add, just in response to, I know what the concern sort of is, but if you could hear me out on it. I mean, first of all, yeah, 10 years might seem like a long time, but we have precedent certainly during the period 1980 to 89 and during the period 1989 to 2016, several examples of people who would have served on boards for a 9-year stretch or a 10-year stretch. Right? Many, not one or two, there are many. So we've had people serving on boards for 10 years. Given the authority that we're given the board, I remember we'd have increased that authority during the course of these proceedings, authority to be the judge about whether or not somebody can, removal proceedings can begin with respect to a senior officer of the bank, and other major responsibilities that we have given. Having the board build up institutional knowledge and being able to act as a effective and useful, constructive counterbalance to the executives, it's necessary for them to have, long tenure. Now, long is not a quantitative number. Long can be X or Y, right? But just to have long tenure. If the board of the proverbial a company was to change every 3 years, the CEO just rings around that board just by basis of there being a lot of asymmetry with knowledge. The other thing so we wanted tenure, but the other thing that we wanted to achieve in order to protect the integrity of the institution is to make sure that the entire board doesn't change in any one cycle. And it's naturally ordered in that way, not by, it's not how the law is laid out. You just can't change the board in any one cycle. So the terms are not terms of individuals, but they're terms of essentially Director 1, Director 2, Director 3. You can trace the term of Director 1 for the next 40 years. And anybody if the Director 1 leaves before the term is up, the person who replaces that person simply finishes that term, right? So the Director 1 time slot, you know what it is from now until the next century. And so for Director 2 all the way to Director 5. Because the board has the powers that we're giving it, I think it's important that you can't change it in a single administration, but you can always renew it. So having the 2-year stagger means that in any one 5-year administration, you could have 1, 2, or 3 board members coming up for board slots coming up for appointment of board members. So you're always renewing. You're renewing every 2 years. You just can't renew all 5 in any one political cycle. And that is what this seeks to achieve. The length of tenure to build institutional knowledge, a staggering, but also a staggering that ensures that you can't change more than 3 of the 5 in any one administration. And that provides stability of governance, but also provides some amount of insulation from nefarious kind of intention.
Or looked at another way, it just embeds the nefarious intention of your predecessor. Because you can't change them. But yeah, it's
no. But your after the first 5, let's assume, because who knows, we could come to whatever arrangements for the first 5, we talk about them, etc. Right? But after the first set, you always have at least two, depending on when the cycle starts, when it begins, but you always have at least 2 if you go 4 years. If you go 5 years, you could have 3 who come up for renewal. Always, you're guaranteed. You can keep that person, or you can change them. And the next person, the next administration, it could be the same party, but next administration, will also have 2 or 3. But no one has 5.
The effect, of course, is that the first guy can potentially serve for 20 years. 10 plus 10. It just seems, I'm not so obsessed.
That's because we have the renewal. If we could separate Senator Golding, Member Golding.
Yeah, sorry?
If separating the renewal for the moment.
Yeah.
Okay, because that's a separate topic altogether. But just deal with the staggering. If the 20 years is a problem, we can address that separately. But
staggering, I'm on board with the staggering.
No, the 2468.
Yeah.
What it does is, it means that you can't, you are not going. No one 5-year administration or 4-year administration would result in a complete overturning of the board.
Chairman, time out. Chairman, let us be clear. The mystery we're trying to deal with of people becoming gods. Usually it's not the CEOs that become gods in these environments. It is oftentimes the chairman of boards that get that nomenclature and takes such power. So I'm with Senator Golding when Member Golding when he says 10 years into 20 years is too much. I can live with a 7-year, which takes us to 14. But I really don't want to have God so near to the sea on the waterfront. and 20 look to me like an eternity. So I can go with 7, and we can stagger it along that line. Also, I recognize that who get the first pick gets to keep their people there, or those selected in that first round for a long, long time. It's just the luck of the draw. But I don't want to compound that with 20 years and so forth. So I'd want to see a lower start in terms of the period.
Yeah.
That would be there. For
Yeah,
that.
I hear you, I don't understand. But what we give up, just to be clear, what we give up with that is if you had 7 years and you're trying to stagger it, you're going to find, and I know General Counsel did this, there's a map that you'd love to share, I believe. You want to share your map? I know you want to share your map. Share your map, or your diagram. But what we give up is that you're going to be able to change the entire board the staggering is not going to stagger across political cycles. You're going to be able to change the entire board in a cycle. Because
all 5 will mature with a 7-year appointment. Will all 5 will mature?
Remember, it's a difference that matters, right? Because we're going 2, 4, 8, 6, 10. The maximum difference is 6 years, right? Between the 2 and the 10, and 6 is definitely beyond the term. So you know by mathematical certainty you cannot change all 5. When the difference is 5, you're saying 2, 3, or you're saying nothing, you're saying 4, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The difference is 4. When the difference is 4, it means that you will have you're mathematically certain to have a time period where 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 will come up in a political cycle. And what I just said in a couple of sentences shares a...
So one is stressing the virtue of not having any political administration being able to determine the entire, apart from the first one. The first one gets that, but no one else afterwards does. That's one trade-off, as opposed to not having a situation in which you're establishing the possibility of somebody, serving for a very long tenure, 20-year tenure. So
the 20-year we can deal with by talking about renewal, and I'm willing to say, once you serve 10 years, you cannot serve again. I would meet you there, all right, by taking out even though that, that's a cost.
There's a cost to that too.
There's a cost to that, but we could.
It meets the concern you have.
But it meets the concern that you have.
And if I could add, Chair, that there is that issue of people who might stay all that time, but the experience shows, one point to emphasize, these long terms are intended to also give to the individual or reassure their personal independence, meaning that whoever appointed them, it's a feature of life. You appoint people, you have to appoint a good person, because they may or may not, once they're appointed and become Bank of Jamaica people, the idea is that they should be thinking about the bank itself as their primary responsibility. So the longer term gives them that sort of personal independence. Experience shows in countries with long terms that the person is not trapped for that long term, and you do get a turnover. That's something the Chair alluded to, that actually, it's the term that's fixed, not the individual. And individuals will leave and others will replace them during that term. And we can get some statistics on the experience in, say, the US or Chile or wherever it is, US mainly, I think, on that kind of question.
General Counsel, introduce your...
Okay, so this is new and different math. So what it is this drawing, we have 3 drawings here, and it just visualizes for us what could happen. So the first page represents a scenario which is in the bill, and that is a scenario where you have a 10-year tenure, and you have staggering every two years. So in first go round, as you'll see, when appointments are made. Oh, and I should mention that the red lines represent what we would say is a change in administration. And so those are the red lines, horizontal lines. So member 1, member 2, member 3, member 4, and member 5, the first go round, someone would be appointed for 2 years, someone for 4 years, someone for 6, 8, 10 years, and the changes you'll see there. Based on these scenarios, so after the first go round, everybody would then be appointed for 10-year periods, and you'll see the staggering there. So when you count, you will see just visibly that for any term that you see here, let us look at the years 2011 to 2021 to 2025. For that period, you'll see that 1, 2, 3 members would be changed. So I'm just giving you an idea of how this diagram works. And if you would believe me, then you would see that for the entire drawing and the period, between 2 and 3 members out of the 5 might be changed during a political or an administration, a 5-year period. The second option, which if you turn the page, relates to a scenario which the mathematicians did on the following basis. You have a 1.5-year stagger and a 7.5-year tenure. And for that scenario, no more than 3 members out of the 5 or 60 would change during any administration. It might be a little awkward, though, to manage it on the basis of the half years, but this is how the math would work out. The final option that was just put here represents the option that Member Golding had put forward as a possibility for consideration. And for this one, you'll see it's a 1-year stagger, 7-year tenure, and if you count just visually, then you'll see that for the periods involved, between 2 or all 5 members could be changed in an administration. And so this would demonstrate, I think, the points that were made earlier.
Chairman, it's kind of clear that I understand the intent and the logic of my friends from the Bank of Jamaica, but the red line doesn't stay constant. It doesn't move only
that's true.
every 5 years, and so that it needs to take into account. Sorry, Mark.
It very rarely is 5 years.
In other words, that's a vagary that you have no control over. So ideally, all things being equal, if we had the US type thing, what's fixed date, which by the way, did I recall somebody proposing fixed date some years ago? No longer holding to fixed date elections. Huh? Oh, it's a lot of proposal not to be implemented. But in the absence of a fixed date election, this would not necessarily work the way you wish. So if you have a 3-year and a 2-year election, depending on what suits me as Prime Minister, all of this goes through the window. So even you could have an incoming administration.
No, but Senator Brown, the fundamental point is whatever, by giving the longest possible length of an administration, she's making the point that this system guarantees that you can't change all 5.
No, I'm not asking to change all 5, but I'm not buying into the model which gives me a factor that is constant when I know that factor is variable. So the making of gods in these institutions, I have a problem with. And the longer you have somebody as a right being on the board, give them a certain power and authority that I don't want to give 20 years.
So we've already said, Senator Brown, that put it out to you to consider. Let us deal with that concern about 20 years in another way. It's very attractive, I would put, to have staggering and also have the assurance that each administration would be able to renew the board but not completely change it. Yeah, completely change the entire board. And that's what that is the kernel that I'd like to preserve even if it means giving up the reappointment.
Except one in the initiator would.
Yeah,
appoint the
initiator,
higher,
and the way about it, that
right.
I could, we could deal with that.
We could, if you're willing. The yes.
Minister, are you willing for the initiator, the first go around, to have a different approach to the appointments so that it involves a greater degree of consultation and possible agreement in the first round? Because that is really the critical thing to determine whether going along there is that amount of variety in the mix.
And confidence. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think ideally that would be the case, that the first 5 were appointed, since it's one minister appointing all 5, and that's the only time that will ever happen, unless the act is amended, which is possible. But, to the extent that there was some bipartisanship in the settling of who the persons would be, that would be good. The question I just had for you is, when they're eligible for reappointment, the persons who are appointed for staggered periods, the first set are eligible for reappointment. For what duration? Is it anticipated that the reappointment is for 10 years?
That's what's anticipated as it is written.
And it's written like that, where again?
Yes. Look at page 29, subsection 3. For a fixed term of 10 years at the end of this subsection.
Right, but it's predicated on the director having the membership of the director having a vacancy have arisen prior to the expiration of the full term of 10 years, or prior to the expiry of the term of a director appointed pursuant to subparagraph 2. But if that term under subparagraph 2 has not, if the vacancy hasn't occurred prior to the expiry of that, but that person has served their 2 or 4 or 6 or 8 year terms, what then is the applicable renewal period?
So the provisions are structured. If you look at 4 addresses the fact, it essentially says that a director who is appointed for 10 years, a full term, can't be reappointed unless he was one of the initial directors. And that was a sort of compromise, because one of them would be 2 years, one
I
would
see 4
be,
is saying
be
that
10.
Once you're not one of the first 5, other than the first of the first 5, then you can't be reappointed, right? But that's dealing with a slightly different thing. I'm asking the persons who are appointed initially, other than the 10-year guy, but the 8, 6, 4, and 2-year guys, their reappointment, well, I'm saying it's not very clear as to what their reappointment is, because if you look at 3, it's talking about if their vacancy occurs prior to the expiry of the term of a director appointed under subparagraph 2. And it might not be prior to the expiry, it might be just that it has expired, the 2, the 4, the 6, the 8 may have expired. So I'm just saying that could be made clear, I think, if the intention is that they get to go for another 10. Intention is that, it could be just say by reappointed for 10 years. Is it up to or it's 10 years? Fixed, it's a fixed term, isn't it?
Yes.
It's 10 years. So you could just put that in 2 to make it clear that those people are reappointed for 10 years. So then you have somebody who's going to be there for 20 years, 18 years, 16 years, and so on, if that happens.
That was a question, though. I think that's a fair point, if I may say, and that would remedy the gap there. But just to raise a more substantive point, so let's say there is a person who's served 4 years, up for reappointment, and there is an unexpired portion of a term that he or she could be appointed to, do we want to preclude that and say no, they can only be reappointed for 10 years if there happens to be an unexpired portion available? So that might be something to consider, not excluding that possibility.
That scenario is covered by 3 and says it's a fixed 10-year appointment, doesn't it? So you're saying maybe that should be reconsidered and it should be permissible to be appointed for the remaining duration of that person's term.
Three covers the appointment of a person to that unexpired term. It says that that's what would happen.
And then they're eligible
but the question
for reappointment.
I thought you were raising was whether the person who had served at 2, the initial staggered terms, as worded, whether they could be appointed to one of those unexpired terms. I mean, your original point was whether they could be appointed for a 10-year term.
I was just saying it wasn't clear to me that what would apply to them because of the way that 3 was worded. It didn't seem that 3 really applied to them
and I think,
as worded.
I think it was not clear, I think. So I think putting in that language you suggested maybe putting the 10 years at 2 would work. And then I raised the question as well, maybe we want them to also be able to serve a term under 3 as well.
So the point in relation to under 3, just take me through it. So that would be, say, someone was appointed for 8 years, say, and then they died after 4 years, and you're saying that the person who was appointed in their stead, rather than be a 10-year person, could be...
I was making the point that a person who, let's say, was appointed for 8 years and serves that 8 years under 2, they can be reappointed for a full 10-year term on expiry of that term. That's what we intend at 2. But what if at the time that they're up for reappointment, there's another member whose term is vacant, another period whose term is vacant? Let's say somebody who was appointed for 10 years and has 2 years left, that person has stepped down. Can this individual who had the initial staggered term be appointed to one of those shorter terms? I think the answer would be
would now bring to mind whether under 4, you'd have to probably clarify under 4 then that when you say a full term of 10 years, you're talking about 10 consecutive years. It now begs that question, because if in the first scenario he was serving 4 years and then he takes up somebody else's 2 years.
But I thought the idea was it's Director A and Director B, and it's not individual specific. So if you were a Director A guy, you can't suddenly become a Director B guy, can you?
I was raising. If in these initial, the people at 2 who serve these shorter terms, just coming from your question about reappointment, we should clarify that yes, they can be, that we mean for them to be reappointed, eligible for reappointment for a full 10-year term, which is what a full term is, a Director A or a Director B term. And then just I was raising the question of just that incident where there is a vacancy for an unexpired term. Because remember, it's not as if, despite the potential for gods, my experience is that it's not that members are people who to be appointed are anxious to be committing for 10 years. Just to be clear, I think people, we're going to have to work with that minister, chairman, in terms of getting people comfortable with accepting such appointments, such long-term appointments, because it does carry a burden of standing differently from other public sector bodies and boards in our political system. So it's not necessarily going to be that, everybody will want that. So there could be people who have served a time and say, well, I'm willing to serve further, but, there is this available term, can you put me in that one? And the only question is whether we want to structure this to permit it or not.
It complicates it a bit. From a drafting perspective, I would imagine. I can see the drafters saying...
We wouldn't lose much by leaving this point out, just to be clear here. I think, I'm sure...
My question is, who does the reappointment? How does, in other words, where the person is eligible for reappointment, whose decision is that?
That is going to be, the appointment is by Governor General and Council, so it will be the minister who makes that proposal to Cabinet for the person to be reappointed or not. But as I said, I'm willing to,
Yeah.
I hear you on the 20 years, and to find a workaround that, I think,
Yeah.
I'm totally open to that.
Yeah. So is it clear who does how the reappointment works? Where is it stated? Who does it? Because the appointment is made in a very particular way,
Yeah.
involving the Governor General, in council, etc.
Right.
That's not how the reappointment presumably is done, because the person's already been selected, right? So it's a reappointment.
No, but the person's appointment ends on a particular date, so they have to go through the process again. The instrument of appointments has a period of time on it.
Right. So I understand that. I'm just wondering whether the decision about that is the same decision-making mechanism as the initial appointment. That it's yeah.
I assumed it to be the same process. It's a reappointment, it's another appointment, it's another term. And I'm not seeing anything that would suggest otherwise.
It's not stated anywhere.
No, it's not stated.
I think it should be clear, because it's a little unusual, because the appointment provision is kind of unusual. So the appointment is under 6, is it? 6(2)(d)? Appointed by the Governor General and Council. They are appointed by, eligible for reappointment.
And member, if I may, it's speaking to eligible for reappointment.
Yes.
It suggests to me that that's done and you can go again. You're eligible. It's not guaranteed. I am thinking that what it is saying is that you go through the same process, which is how it works now too.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't think it's useful to state it, then I mean, it's not a big point for me, because I accept what you're saying. I mean, I think the bigger point is that, the first go around, those appointments go potentially from 12 to 20 years, and after that, it's a 10-year regime, isn't it? So I think that disparity is a little awkward. I don't have any particular thing to suggest. But
the challenge, if we said they weren't eligible for reappointment, then maybe for the 2, 4, 6, or the 2 and 4 is probably administratively burdensome. There's nothing stopping us from saying that.
No. I mean, I think the only issue to consider is...
For example, sorry, Governor. For example, we have existing directors now. If any of them were to come into this, it could be somebody who has already served for 5 years who you're going to give a 2-year appointment. And then you say that 2 year is not eligible for renewal. And the 4 year is not eligible for renewal. I mean, there's no fundamental problem with that.
There's no reason to say that. It's just a note, if I may, Chair, that, finding members who are qualified and not conflicted and willing to serve for the board of the Bank of Jamaica has, through different administrations, been a special challenge. The board today lacks its full appointed complement. And so even this number 5 that seems ample isn't necessarily. And, we're designing a more rigorous even responsibility for this board. So I think it's probably not. I understand the points about the concerns about longevity and guards. At the same time, I just would like to stress that there is a general challenge about finding people willing to serve on this board. I mean, I hope. Well, we'll see how that develops. Maybe we can develop more people, but it's not that straightforward. Also, we're generating through this mechanism a total of 8 other appointees, sort of board-like appointees to the other committees, to keep in mind that it's a sort of a network of 13 individuals who will have this sort of governance responsibility of different kinds in the different committees. So with that in mind, I'm racking my brains to think of what other method, if anything, might help to counterbalance the gods concept. Okay, little gods. One factor to...
No, but sorry. I want to make a good attempt to deal with the 20-year point. if we don't allow renewals, what it fundamentally means is that on a worst case scenario, over 10 years, you're going to have to find 10 people as opposed to 5 people. And over 10 years, finding 10 people, yeah, if they're service full term, I'm saying, should not be, it's difficult. It's difficult. It is difficult. I know it is difficult.
We are not succeeding in doing this.
Even
have
now.
not been for the last many years.
Several
okay?
years.
So,
having a full complement of
Oh,
board
I
members.
really see it, given the skill sets that is required is more for retention. And dealing with all the criteria of conflict. But
How many do you have now on the board?
the members, there are 4 appointed members. The law provides for 6.
there's a vacancy. There are 2 vacancies,
2
sorry.
vacancies, yeah.
So you're telling me, out of all of Jamaica, you can't find 2 people to fill that slot?
We've had tired and we had to move on and they need to be filled.
And
But
that
the
will
process
happen.
of filling when the vacancy arises is not, because of the conflict, the person can't hold shares in financial institutions. Not, we've you identify people from time to time and they say, why, I'm not selling what I have. It's a non-conflicting, huh? It's insulated, yeah.
Is, as we've seen in the other countries, which is the point here, but it doesn't lead people typically to sit in the they get. So if I may, Chairman, I think the important point there, and I
No, take
agree
your
with
point.
that.
We need to search deeper.
Yes, wider, deeper searches and so on, but remember that it's still in the hands of, and properly so, of different administrations. So they are the ones who will be renewing the board, and what we want to make sure we don't have is one of two extremes. Vacancies on this board, that will just undermine the protections we're developing to check the governor and so on. On the other hand, appointments that aren't up to the job. Are not prepared adequately and so on. So I think you can widen the pool, and some countries have gone as far as advertising minister and other things, and in a way the chair has you've led the way with the approach to the governor, my replacement, my successor, in terms of a practical approach that is the first time we've done it this way. You've done it, I should say you rather. So I think these things can be extended to how you find board members and so on to widen that pool. But it doesn't change the fact, I think, that there are difficulties, and a lot of it comes from conflict of interest, because there's so many things that the bank touches that the nature of the conflicts are extensive, and I suspect when the new board really grapples with a proper governance, a fuller governance charge, I think they may get even narrower, the space may get even narrower, because of just the ways in which the financial sector intersects with the lives of an individual board member. And we have to face how do you allow that to happen and avoid the individuals being accused, for example, or being perceived as conflicted when all they did was own a house, have a mortgage, get a deal on insurance or something like that. Yet the very party that they're dealing with is being supervised or regulated, or the decision-making on interest rates, the timing of when they decided to do something happens to coincide or come just before or after a decision. We protect them and the public and the institution from that sort of conflict. I believe that's what was behind the Parliament's position on the amendments a few years back that tightened or strengthened the conflict provisions in the Act for the board in 2014 amendments. To move it from the standard that is normal for boards of companies to a standard that did not leave it to the board to decide whether a particular conflict, as declared, would disqualify the person from listing or participating in that decision. It moved to saying no ownership of shares at all is permitted. That sort of tightening of the standard properly, I think, came out of this body and the interest in governance. So it then continues to limit not the qualifications of the people who could serve, but the people who would be willing to serve or able to serve.
Chairman, I can't operate on the basis of what is now only. I have to look at what is possible, because otherwise we're going to be so restrictive that only few will be able to serve on the board. They will become not just gods, but super gods in an important institution. You, Chairman, as Minister, have said, let's advertise for all board positions. That's where the government is going. It's part of the corporate governance approach. There are many Jamaicans here and abroad who may wish to apply. And of course, we'll have to then take out the conflicts where they are and in shortlisting the thing. So I am not moved to adopt a position which says it's so hard to fill the board and fill it, so that we're going to then make some people 10 and 20 and 16. But let me also make this point, Minister. I remember Golden had raised the issue of Director A, B, C, D, E, and whether E had 2 years at the expiry of his 2 year, and coincidentally A with a 10-year dies, whether that 2 can then go into the 10-year slot, do the rest of the 10-year. And so the interchanging of the years, whether you're 2 year, 3 year, 2 year, 4 year, whatever, how we're going to deal with that. And it strikes me that we need to spend a little time having regard for this discussion to redraft 24, to put the safeguards in to avoid people, the same set of people, remaining on the board.
You're saying, as it is written now, you believe it allow somebody who has
for example,
they have a 2-year instrument.
Yeah,
And you're saying they could jump.
instrument.
The guy has a 2-year instrument. The 10-year becomes available, and they could jump into the 10-year. But their letter says.
Maybe on a coincidental expiration, or one guy resigned, not well resigned, just when I resign, when my 2-year expires.
No, but unless it says that you can't reappoint.
What it says is that the person who is a director for a replacement is appointed for the unexpired term. So
Right.
You're seeking somebody outside. If that person was doing 10 years and had to leave at year 8, is a replacement from outside, not somebody inside who have 6 is going to take up that slot with the experience.
If we had a provision that says once you have an appointment on the board, you can't get another one, that would deal with that concern. Whether it said reappoint or otherwise, once you've been appointed for a term,
right,
you can't get another consecutive term, or you can't get another term period. I don't know.
It does strike me though as being unfair to the 2-year and the 4-year guy. The 10-year guy is privileged to serve 20 if you want. But the 2-year guy, as bright as, or brighter than, more competent,
It's just like...
and is limited by the fact that... So I'm saying...
Chair, there's no reason
So
to
the
treat
2-year
them-
guy is not the god.
No.
You could treat him...
The 10 and 8 you're going to
You could treat them differently, Chair.
Mr. Brown, in a world that we don't really like when you have fixed term contract. The man who have the 2-year fixed term contract,
I can live with
right,
them.
can get a longer contract already in the job. Is somebody that comes from outside is going to fill this space.
You're saying to make it clear on that, and maybe we say the 8 and the 10 can't be reappointed, but the 2, 4, 6, that's a lot of drafting.
Yeah, but that can be done, I
But it
think.
can be accommodated.
Can be done.
No,
This-
no,
these
the
are-
one on saying that you want to keep the track separate,
Yeah,
explicitly separate.
that's what's here.
Yeah,
Everybody's in a,
separate track.
as you said, for millennia to come, your stagger will continue forever. The Clark stagger.
Chair,
Not because of drinking though, right?
Before you do any staggering, Chair, if I can, I don't know what you're talking about, but just a point on the God issue. Again, the control. I just want to remind us that this is about we're developing a board that for the first time will be able to check the governor. So we have to keep that in mind. Just saying, this is about an adequate and effective counterweight that can hold the system accountable. I'm not gainsaying. I think the stagger that you discussed on limiting one of that's perfectly fine. It can be written here, I think, especially in these initial provisions that are basically transitional. We're talking about how to get the thing going, and I think you feel free to adjust it in that way. But keep in mind that we're trying to structure a team of outsiders, part-timers, who can control, who can hold the board, the governor and the team there accountable, and so that they're doing the job that you want them to do.
So, because I know Member Golden has to leave, and this is the last of your comments so let's just see if we can. So if we said that the 2, 4, and 6 can be reappointed, but the 8 cannot, and 10 cannot, and you can't take up somebody on the board cannot take up the unexpired portion of another person's appointment. Somebody already on the board. The unexpired
portion already
portion
on the board is in a particular track.
In a particular track.
So you don't want them to stay in them lane.
Switch in. Stay in them lane.
Can you just clarify one other point, Chair, in terms of the understanding? I think you touched on it in terms of whether we're just dealing here with consecutive appointments. So if somebody comes off the board, they're doing something else for a year or two, they can be, this is silent, but they can be appointed to the board. Yeah.
I think that's a normal thing when you say is eligible for reappointment, and does that mean once you've come off that you're never eligible again? I don't think so. I've never heard it.
Just looking for clarity in terms
I don't know if the AGs can shed any light on that.
No, I was just confirming the clarity of what the understanding we have here, which should be, as you said, Senator Golding. Member Golding, beg your pardon.
I'm sorry, I have to run because of something else, but I just wanted to make, there's one little point I think to do with the schedules. The last thing in my memo, which was consultation with the leader of the opposition. It was in, I can't remember it's apropos of what now, but the last, it is to do, page, yes, it's in the second schedule, I think. Page 33, clause 25, the very last part of clause 25. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Banking Services Act. The appointed members shall be appointed by the Governor General in council. We're deleting that, right? No, we're substituting that for something else, yes. That's, what's my thing? Yeah, I think the suggestion was that since the 2 external members of the supervisory committee will no longer be appointed on the advice of the minister after consulting with the supervisor, they're now going to be appointed by the cabinet, right? That's what this is saying essentially. So we had suggested that they be, after consultation with the leader of the opposition, for the 2 external members. I'm going to leave that point with you now.
it, it was, before it was advice of the minister after consulting with the supervisor. So why, we could keep the consultation in there. Why don't we just keep the consultation in there? Just keep the consultation in there with the supervisor, yeah. Yeah, that's, okay?
Or I think with the board. Maybe.
Or with the board?
Yeah, it may be that, yeah, with the board.
With the board. We have that, that's a precedent we have earlier.
I think so. I'm just thinking somewhere else. Do we have it?
Please, there's some things BOJ didn't get back to us on yet. The capitalization point, I think there was some work being done by the BOJ on that. I don't know what you're thinking of, since we've kind of finished the clause by clause.
Yeah, we're trying to finish the clause by clause today.
I think I skipped one of my things. We haven't really finished.
Right, and on like the distribution and so on. What I was, just in the interest of time, what I'd propose is that because if we have to meet again, it's going to really.
What we should do is meet again to review a draft report.
That is what.
Yeah. Hopefully that issue as well. So it will be an incomplete draft report because there will be that piece of outstanding work to be done.
Right. So
yeah.
it would be enough weeks to have the
maybe
report done. And would we do the amendments with the draft amendments, or just the report?
Well, ideally
Both.
the draft amendments, if you can. I don't know whether you've started to do any of that yet or not, but you haven't. Yeah.
So the draft report and the draft amendments. That would be the next meeting.
Yeah. Yeah. And if that goes well, it could be the final meeting.
Yeah.
And then with the final report would just be circulated for signature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So moving on to, can we, oh, no, right, 24 goes all the way down.
There's paragraph
So we're in
2.
B?
Yes, B. Okay. So just to mention, if I may, Minister, that on page 29 of the bill, paragraph B, this relates to paragraph 2 of the schedule to the Act, and it proposes to add additional disqualification provisions with respect to the appointed directors. The current provisions disqualify persons who are a person who is a member of either House of Parliament, persons who may be a director, officer, or employee, or persons with ownership interest in a licensee, and member of KSAC or any municipal council. At C, it seeks to update reference to the KSAC or municipal council to the wording referred to here. And at 2, it seeks to exclude persons who are employed with the government, statutory body or authority, or an executive agency, or government company, sorry. Thank you. In relation to... Sorry.
Listen, a government company or a company controlled by government, having regard for another legislation, because there's some of the companies may not be owned by government fully, but sufficient shares in that company. And I think a set of legislation address those companies, that the government influence those companies.
I recall that government company is defined in elsewhere in this act, or I think it's the Interpretation Act. Just a moment. Member, I know it was defined elsewhere, but if you let me come back, I'll tell you exactly where. But it's defined. Double check. I'll get back to you on it, but it is defined elsewhere. I just have to.
Maybe the PBMA or the FAA.
Possibly, yes. I'll come back and tell you in a moment. In relation to, if I may go on in the meantime,
Yes, please.
item E, item C, 24C of the bill introduces at the proposed new paragraph 2A of the schedule qualification requirements for the directors, which is absent from the current legislation, and persons appointed as directors that's the appointed members, should not be employees of the bank and should have experience or knowledge in economics, banking, finance, commerce, accounting, business, or law. In relation to D, the proposal is in the bill for deleting paragraph 3, which currently provides that the minister may appoint any person who might be appointed a director to act temporarily in place of a director who is absent or unable to act. Under clause 224D of the bill, the proposed deletion is consistent with the provisions that remove from the minister the power to appoint directors of the bank, and it was not felt necessary to retain this provision in relation to appointment of temporary director. Next one up would be paragraph 4.1 of the schedule to the Act, which presently provides that any director other than the governor may at any time resign his office by instrument in writing addressed to the minister and transmitted to the governor, and from the date of the receipt by the minister of such instrument, such director shall cease to be a director of the bank. Clause 24C proposes amendment of paragraph 4.1 of the schedule and adds a new subparagraph 1A to provide that on receipt of that instrument of resignation, the minister shall advise the Governor General of the resignation, and of course, this bears in mind the appointment being made by the Governor General in Council. Paragraph 4.2 provides that the governor may resign his office by instrument in writing addressed to the minister. It is proposed that this provision be amended to include the senior deputy governor who, like the governor, would be appointed by the Governor General in Council, and also adds that the minister should advise the Governor General of such resignation also. Member Goldin, sorry.
Good. When does this resignation take effect? On receipt by the minister, on receipt by the Governor General?
I think that's addressed in here. Oh, upon receipt of the instrument, it's here. The minister shall so advise the Governor General of such resignation. Oh, the effective date. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, under 4.1 of the schedule, it currently says, and from the date of receipt by the minister of such instrument, such director shall cease to be a director of the bank. And so this is really following from that. Member Goldin had made a point.
Just before you go.
Yes.
I'm just trying to think back on another case. If the Governor General makes the appointment, on what basis does the letter to the minister kind of act here now as somebody else acted in the senatorial issue in Senate next door from Jamaica House to King's House, and it didn't take effect unless it got to King's House directly. I think that's kind of the ruling in that famous case. So I'm just wondering if the appointment is by the Governor General in Council, or why does that resignation take effect with the minister? Just trying to see if it's consistent, or should it not be on receipt by the Governor General?
Those are constitutional positions, though. The one that you're referring to.
Because these bills must live within the Constitution.
No, meaning that it doesn't. It doesn't rise to the same level, but
those who make the appointment must make the disappointment. So the question is.
Yeah, so this
I'm trying to clarify.
No, so this is Governor General in Council. This is not Governor General. It's so the Governor General is in Council, is advised by Cabinet. The Minister is the conduit. So it's entirely appropriate for the minister to be the person to be in receipt of the resignation letter. No, in respect of your thing is about when does it become effective.
That's the point I'm making. When the minister gets it or when it gets to the Governor General?
No, it's when the minister gets it.
Why, if the minister doesn't make the appointment, the letter getting to the minister represent the date, the effective date of the resignation. What if the person writes to the Governor General and says, really, I didn't intend to resign on that date? I just want us to clarify and to be clear the effective date now, because usually legislation says that the effective date of the resignation is where the letter goes to the minister. So
yeah, so it's in the original, it's in the underlying bill. It's in the schedule. That's what she was reading from. So this would complement that. It's already there.
4.1 says that 4.1 of the schedule now says that it's upon receipt by the minister is when it becomes effective. 4.1a is inserting the transmission by the minister to the Governor General of that advice, so that to tie the loop there.
No, 4.1 of the
on page 30 is 4.1a, the proposed 1a. Right, and it's following 1, which contains the provision that says any director other than the governor may at any time resign his office by instrument in writing, addressed to the minister and transmitted through the governor, and from the date of the receipt by the minister of such instrument, such director shall cease to be a director of the bank. And 1a now ties in this obligation on the minister to provide the advice to the Governor General when he receives such an instrument.
That is to say, the members have resigned.
Yes.
And I just wanted to clarify, you were saying the resignation is effective the date it gets to the minister.
Yes. I mean, and that's just preserving the existing term.
Preserving the existing arrangement.
Existing language of the timing, yeah. But adding now that there must be notice by the minister to the Governor General when that happens.
Right. So it's in there, Senator Brown. Okay. I think F.
Okay. Could I just mention, to take care of the other point, the government company was mentioned at page 39. It was defined already previously, and I think the decision had been made to move it up. Page 13 of the bill had defined government company, which is the same definition as in the PBMA, and I think that at that time the decision was made to move it into the general provision. Right, and we decided to put it up to the definition section. Sorry.
Claire, you're saying that you're going to move it from this part and make it apply to the entire bill.
That's my recollection that had been said earlier.
Okay.
And the reason we had said it is because it was being used more than once. That's my recollection.
You see, I have a concern because it's just check to see, because in the banking services bill, it's defined in a particular way. In part 5AA of when you're dealing with the committee, it's defined in a particular way. So you need to make a determination as to which definition you would want to use for the purposes of the schedule where you refer to it.
So when we had looked at it, I believe we had looked at the PBMA when it was being drafted. I think the draftsman might have been following through the definition in the PBMA, and that was the one that had been followed. Right.
in relation to appointments to the Monetary Policy Committee, you realize you would say, hey, in this part, unless the context otherwise requires. So that definition of government company only refers to that part. That's what I'm saying to you. Look again and ensure that this is what you want to apply to the entire, all the provisions of the bill. Yes, it does. It does. Page 10 of the Banking Services Act.
Okay. So thank you for that. So Minister, if with your permission, perhaps we could collaborate and see whether there is an adjustment or whether the same definition would be applicable and reconcile it throughout.
Okay, F.
Thank you. The proposed amendment of paragraph 5 of the schedule allows for the termination of the appointment of the governor and senior deputy governor being by the governor general in council instead of the minister, consistent with provisions that shift the authority of appointment to the GG in council. The deputy governors and directors are deleted from the paragraph as the termination of their appointments would already have been covered by section 6D, 5A, and 6.6 of the Act. As mentioned by Member Golding with respect to his comments on the previous section 6D, 5A of the Act, clause 690 of the bill, we would propose that paragraph 5B of the schedule to the Act be amended to read becomes bankrupt. I believe at that time the comment was made that a definition for bankrupt should be introduced, and I believe the decision was that if that was done, adjustments would have to be made throughout. And so I believe that point was taken. In relation to remuneration of directors, which is in the schedule paragraph 8, clause 24G of the bill seeks to amend paragraph 8. The current provision speaks to the remuneration of the governor and other directors being determined by the minister. The proposed amendment provides that the remuneration of directors other than the governor and senior deputy governor be determined by the minister after consultation with the governor. Members previously agreed that the remuneration of governor, senior deputy governor, and deputy governors should be by the minister on the recommendation of the appointed members of the board, and so that would be noted. This provision, as revised, deals only with the appointed members of the board. Schedule paragraph 8A. Establishment of the Audit Committee. Clause 24H of the bill proposes a new paragraph 8A of the schedule to the Act to provide for the appointment of an Audit and Risk Committee and such other committees as the board considers necessary. There is no such provision in the present Act. This provision would be consistent with the provisions of Section 8.2 of the PBMA, which requires a board of a public body that has 4 or more directors to establish an audit committee. In relation to page 32 of the bill, we now move into some amendments that are being proposed to other legislation. The first one that we would mention and is reflected here at page 32 is a definition that is being inserted for the Banking Services Act. So the first legislation being addressed is the Banking Services Act. As members will recall, the Financial Policy Committee, which is being established under the Bank of Jamaica Act, handles financial policy matters. This meant that there are going to be changes to be made in the Banking Services Act to take from that act some of the provisions which would normally fall within the ambit of the Supervisory Committee. And so the first thing is that the Financial Policy Committee is defined in the Banking Services Act to include the definition and to include reference to the fact that it is established under the Bank of Jamaica Act. The next point is Section 5 of the Banking Services Act, which I'll refer to perhaps as the BSA. The proposed amendment of Section 5.2 of the BSA seeks to amend the functions of the Supervisor and Supervisory Committee to include a provision that the primary objective of the Supervisory Committee is the exercise of supervisory functions under the Act and any other enactment to include, It seeks to amend the functions of the Supervisor and the Supervisory Committee to include a provision that the primary objective of the Supervisory Committee in the exercise of its supervisory functions under the Act and any other enactment is to promote the safety and soundness of deposit-taking institutions and the deposit-taking system. This satisfies the Basel Core Principles 1 essential criterion 2, which states that the primary objective of banking supervision is to promote the safety and soundness of banks and the banking system. If the banking supervisor is assigned broader responsibilities, these are subordinate to the primary objective and do not conflict with it. And so this amendment is to bring this point forward. The next one, BSA Section 7. In keeping with the amendments proposed to the Bank of Jamaica Act, the amendment proposed is to Section 7 of the Banking Services Act, which addresses functions of the Supervisory Committee, and it removes from that section subclauses or paragraphs H and M, which deal with financial policy matters. H, which is now being removed from the BSA and was already included under the provisions of the functions from the Supervisory Committee, H speaks to the making of regulations under Part 26 for the operation of licensees, and M, the standards of sound practices for licensees. And as I say, recall that those are now included under the FPC functions. Next one is 131 of the BSA, which provides that the Supervisory Committee shall make certain regulations relating to financial policy matters with the approval of the Minister. These would now fall again under the FPC, and this includes, for example, regulations pertaining to license fees, capital adequacy, amalgamations, transfers. The schedule of the bill proposes amendment of Section 131 by substituting the FPC for the SC for these functions in that provision. Similarly, at Section 132 of the Banking Services Act, it provides that the SC, Supervisory Committee, may make rules for the operation of licensees, supervisory rules which would now fall under the FPC. The schedule of the bill proposes this substitution. And now, for the composition of the Supervisory Committee, second schedule of the Banking Services Act, the proposed amendment to paragraph 1 of the second schedule to the BSA provides that the appointed members of the Supervisory Committee shall not be members of the Board of Directors and shall be appointed by the Governor General in Council after consultation with the Board. Under present construct, no reference is made to their not being members of the bank's board, and their appointment under paragraph 4 is by the Governor General on the advice of the Minister. Of note is that based on the discussions that the committee held earlier, the recommendation would be that after the words Board of Directors, one, it is proposed, would add statutory committees, and therefore in the bill, where it says shall not be members of the Board of Directors, the proposal then for consistency would be that one would add or statutory committees of the bank as defined by the Bank of Jamaica Act. The comments, I believe Member Golden raised his comments in relation to that one already.
Yes, with that already.
Right. So, Banking Services Act, second schedule, paragraph 5.1 deals with the term of appointment of supervisory committee members. The schedule of the bill proposes amendment of paragraph 5.1 to provide that the term of the appointed members shall be 5 years instead of not exceeding 3 years, and this is for consistency with respect to the other statutory committees, MPC and FPC appointments are both for 5 years, and so this is consistent. Second schedule, paragraph 5.3, revocation of appointment of SC members. The schedule of the bill proposes the amendment of paragraph 5.2 of the BSA to provide that the revocation of the appointment of the supervisory committee members shall be by the Governor General in Council instead of the Governor General on the advice of the Minister. PBMA section 5.3. So we have completed the section on the Banking Services Act. Banking Services Act completed. The Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act, based on the proposal at Clause 3 of the bill for the amendment of the PBMA to provide that the bank would be exempt from its provisions. The current Section 5.3, which exempts the bank from the provisions of Section 5.1 of the PBMA, would no longer be necessary. So if the bank, of course, is exempt from the provisions
Chairman,
of
could
the...
you read for us what the 5.3 in the PBMA says?
Oh, okay. Just a moment.
You have it there.
Well, I have it. Oh, it's in the left-hand pages. Sorry. If you have that nearby.
5.3 says that the provision of subsection 1 shall not apply to the Bank of Jamaica in the exercise of borrowing powers in the performance of functions relating to monetary policy. So that exemption would no longer be necessary if we're taking BOJ out of it altogether and putting the provisions in the schedule or the regulations as the committee directs or proposes.
And that deletion is taking place on the condition that the PBMA issues are going to be in the regulations, which will come simultaneously, you promise, with the Act, Minister.
That is correct. That is correct. Schedule.
Or a schedule, yeah. I think there was some agreement on a schedule to this act, yeah.
Okay, that takes us to the end of the bill.
Sorry, Chairman, I just need to make one point that we observed. If members would just bear with me and look at page 5 of the bill, a related point to the one a while ago. Page 5, everybody has that? It was provided here in the bill that the provisions of the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act shall not apply to this act. In reading it again, it really should say shall not apply to the Bank of Jamaica. So I'm just asking that that be noted.
Okay, so are we at the end of the bill now? Let me ask this time. Just wanted to thank everybody for coming today and for the productive discussions. As we discussed moments ago, the next step is to have the draft report prepared along with the draft amendments, and once those are prepared, to convene another meeting of the Joint Select Committee to review those. And once the Joint Select Committee is satisfied with those, then we would move to the next stage, which is to have those reports signed and move to the next step of the process.
The draft you're speaking of will include the schedule stroke regulations to accompany this.
So is there any other business? The date and time of next meeting can't be set in, from here. Maybe I could get a sense. How long do you think it will take to do the draft reports and amendments? You have to get a report from her first. Yeah. Right. But we don't meet when the Parliament is on recess. We can't have a meeting, right? No.
Chairman, could we have the benefit of the discussion?
No, I was asking. No, she doesn't
I
have
know
a
you
mic
are,
on.
but
Yeah.
I'm just trying to get the benefit.
Can
of
you
the discussion.
just use your mic?
No, I was saying normally we would wait on the report to do the amendments, but I can start the amendments and then we just verify
With the
when the
report.
report is.
Right. Okay, so we just go as fast as we can, possibly, and when it's ready, we convene. You will keep in touch. The bank will keep in touch. That's the best relationship, right? Okay, if there's no other business, can we have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
So move, Chair.
And seconded by Senator Horton. All in favor? Thank you.